The courtroom smelled faintly of old wood and paper, the kind of quiet place where lives could change with a single sentence. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows, casting pale streaks across the polished floor. I sat at the plaintiff's table, my hands resting on a stack of documents that suddenly felt heavier than they should have. Across the room, my father stood beside his lawyer. It had been 5 years since we had spoken face to face. 5 years since my mother's funeral, the last time we had stood in the same room without lawyers, accusations, and strangers watching. Back then, grief had bound us together, or at least I thought it had. Now, as I looked at him across the courtroom, he seemed like a completely different man. Cold, distant, almost like a stranger. The judge entered and everyone stood. The room settled into tense silence as the case began. I had imagined this moment countless times in my head. I believed the truth would come out quickly once the court heard the facts. After all, how could someone deny their own child? But I was about to learn just how far my father was willing to go. His lawyer began first, speaking calmly and confidently. "Your Honor," the man said, adjusting his glasses, "this case concerns a man who has falsely claimed to be my client's son in order to gain access to family assets." A quiet murmur spread through the courtroom. I felt my jaw tighten. "Falsely claimed," the lawyer continued. "My client lost his son many years ago during a classified military operation overseas. The real son never returned." My stomach dropped. I turned slowly toward my father. He didn't look at me. Instead, he stared straight ahead, as if the story being told had nothing to do with me sitting just a few feet away. The judge nodded slightly. "Call your witness." My father stepped forward. I had spent months preparing myself for this moment, but nothing could have prepared me for the words that came next. He took the oath and sat down in the witness chair. His voice sounded steady when he spoke, almost rehearsed. "I had one son," he began, "a brave young man who served his country." The courtroom listened quietly. "He died overseas several years ago." My chest tightened. The judge asked, and the plaintiff. My father finally turned his head and looked directly at me. There was no warmth in his eyes, no recognition, only cold certainty. "That man," he said slowly, pointing his finger at me, "is an impostor." The word echoed through the room like a gunshot. For a moment I couldn't breathe. My father continued speaking as if he were describing a stranger he had never loved. He appeared after my son's death claiming to be him, but I knew immediately something wasn't right. The real boy I raised would never behave the way this man does. Whispers rippled through the spectators. Every sentence he spoke twisted the knife deeper. "He's here for money," my father added. Nothing more. I felt every pair of eyes in the courtroom turn toward me. Strangers were judging me. Believing him, the judge leaned forward. "Do you have any evidence to support your claim?" My father nodded calmly. "Yes, Your Honor. My son died during a military incident overseas. The military informed us that his records were classified, which is why this man has been able to exploit the lack of public documentation." The explanation sounded convincing, too convincing. My lawyer glanced at me, concern flickering in her eyes. She knew how dangerous that statement was. Classified military records meant there were few ways for me to immediately prove the truth. And that was exactly why my father had built his case around it. The judge turned to our table. "Plaintiff," he said, "you've heard the accusations. Do you wish to respond?" I slowly stood up. My legs felt heavier than stone. Looking at my father, I searched for even the smallest hint that this was some terrible misunderstanding. But there was nothing, just the same cold expression. 5 years ago, this man had hugged me before I left for a mission overseas. Now he was telling a courtroom that I had died there, and that I was a fraud. The pain in my chest burned like fire, but I forced my voice to remain steady. "Yes, Your Honor," I said, "I do have something to say." I reached down and opened the briefcase, sitting beside my chair. Inside it was a single sealed envelope, plain, official, but powerful enough to destroy every lie that had just been spoken. The bold seal stamped across the front read, United States Department of Defense. And before the day was over, the truth inside that envelope would silence the entire courtroom. The moment my father called me an impostor in court, something inside me broke. But it wasn't the fragile kind of breaking. It was the kind that hardens you, the kind that forces you to remember every moment that led to that day. Because the truth was, this fight hadn't started in the courtroom, it had started years earlier. I grew up believing my father was a man of honor. He had always carried himself with quiet authority. In our small town, people respected him. When he spoke, others listened. When he made decisions, people trusted them. As a child, I admired him. He was strict but fair. At least that's what I believed back then. When I turned 18, I enlisted in the military. My father had always believed in service and discipline, and joining felt like the one thing that made him proud of me. The day I left for training, he shook my hand firmly. "Make this family proud," he said. For years I did exactly that. I served in places most people would never see, missions that rarely made the news. Long months away from home were the only thing that kept me going, was the thought that my family believed in me. My mother wrote letters constantly. She told me about home, about the garden she kept growing every spring, and about how my father would quietly ask about me even if he pretended not to worry. Those letters meant everything, but everything changed during my final mission overseas. It was dangerous. Complicated, the kind of operation that required complete secrecy. Even our families were told very little about where we were or what we were doing. Then something went wrong. An explosion destroyed one of the facilities we were operating near. Communication with several of us was lost for days. In situations like that, rumors spread fast. Some people believed we had been killed. For a brief time, even the military listed me as missing. Eventually, I made it back safely. The mission ended, and I returned home expecting relief, maybe even a small celebration. Instead, I walked into something I never could have imagined. My father looked at me like he was seeing a ghost. At first, I thought it was shock. After all, he might have believed the rumors about my death, but that wasn't what was happening. Within weeks of my return, he began acting strangely around me. Conversations became shorter, his attitude colder. Then the accusations started. He claimed I wasn't the same person who had left years earlier, that something about me felt different. At first I laughed it off. War changes people, everyone knows that, but my father took it further. One night during dinner he said something that froze the entire room. "You're not my son." My mother immediately shut him down, thinking it was some cruel joke, but he didn't laugh. He looked completely serious. From that moment on, the distance between us grew wider every day. My father stopped speaking to me directly. He started telling relatives strange stories about how the military might have replaced his real son. The idea sounded ridiculous, but my father had influence in our family. Slowly, some people began to question things. When my mother died 2 years later, everything spiraled out of control. My father rewrote his will and removed my name entirely. He started telling people that the real son he once had died during that overseas mission, and that the man who returned afterward was pretending to be him. At first I thought grief had driven him insane, but then he took it even further. He filed a legal complaint accusing me of identity fraud. The man who raised me had officially declared that I was a stranger stealing his dead son's life. That accusation followed me everywhere. Friends became distant. Relatives avoided me. Even people in town started whispering when I walked past. The worst part was that parts of my military service were classified. Certain details about that mission couldn't be publicly discussed. And my father knew it. He had built his entire lie around the one thing I couldn't easily reveal, but he had made one critical mistake. During the investigation, a retired officer from my unit heard about the case. He remembered the mission and the rumors that had spread about my supposed death. When he realized what was happening, he contacted the Department of Defense. He requested special authorization for a document that could finally confirm the truth. The Pentagon reviewed the request, and after weeks of waiting, they approved it. What arrived wasn't just paperwork. It was a sealed letter, one powerful enough to destroy every lie my father had built. And that letter was now sitting inside my briefcase in the courtroom. The courtroom had grown quieter after my father finished his testimony. His words still hung in the air like a heavy fog. Every person in that room had heard him call me an impostor, and judging by the whispers I heard earlier, many of them were starting to believe him. That was the most painful part. My father had always been respected. People trusted his voice more than mine. To them, he was a grieving parent defending the memory of a lost son, and I was just a man claiming to be someone else. My father stepped down from the witness stand with the calm confidence of someone who believed the case was already over. His lawyer gave him a small nod of approval, then turned toward the judge. "Your Honor." The lawyer said smoothly, "The defendant has clearly explained the situation. The real son of my client died during a classified military incident overseas. The man sitting at the plaintiff's table appeared years later claiming to be him." He paused dramatically before continuing, "Without verifiable records, there is no reason to believe this man's story." Several people in the gallery murmured in agreement. My lawyer remained calm beside me, but I could feel the tension in her posture. She leaned closer and whispered quietly, "This is the moment." I nodded slowly. For years I had waited for a chance to defend myself. For years my father had controlled the narrative, turning my life into a strange conspiracy where I was the villain. But he had built his entire story on one assumption. He believed I had no proof. The judge turned toward me. "Plaintiff," he said firmly, "you've heard the testimony. If you have evidence supporting your claim, now is the time to present it." My heartbeat echoed loudly in my ears as I stood up. For a brief moment I looked across the room at my father. He looked completely relaxed, almost bored. To him, this was already finished. I reached down and slowly opened my briefcase. Inside it sat the envelope I had guarded carefully since the day it arrived. Plain white, but marked with an official seal. I pulled it out and held it carefully in both hands. The courtroom grew noticeably quieter as people leaned forward to see what I was holding. My father's lawyer frowned slightly. "Your Honor," he said cautiously, "what exactly is that?" I didn't answer him. Instead, I walked forward and handed the envelope to the court clerk. The moment the clerk saw the seal, her eyes widened slightly. Printed clearly across the front were the words, "United States Department of Defense," and beneath it, a bold stamp from the Pentagon. The clerk delivered the envelope to the judge. The entire room watched as he examined the seal for a moment before carefully breaking it open. A single document slid out. The judge adjusted his glasses and began reading silently. At first, his expression remained neutral. Then something changed. His eyebrows lifted slightly. He reread the first page more slowly. The room had become so quiet that even the sound of paper moving seemed loud. My father shifted uncomfortably in his chair for the first time. Finally, the judge looked up. His voice was calm, but there was a new seriousness in it. "This document comes directly from the Department of Defense," he said. The room remained completely still. "It confirms that the plaintiff served in a classified overseas operation several years ago." I noticed several people in the gallery exchange confused glances. The judge continued reading. "The document also explains that false reports regarding the plaintiff's death were intentionally released during that mission as part of operational security." A ripple of shocked whispers spread through the courtroom. My father's lawyer immediately stood up. "Your Honor, I—" The judge raised a hand. "Sit down." The lawyer slowly lowered himself back into his chair. The judge continued reading from the letter. "The Department of Defense confirms that the plaintiff returned safely after the mission concluded, and that his identity and service record match official military documentation." My father's face began to lose its color, but the judge hadn't reached the most important part yet. He flipped to the final page. His eyes scanned the paragraph slowly before he spoke again. "The Department of Defense further confirms that the plaintiff is the biological son of the defendant in this case." A loud gasp echoed from the gallery. My father froze. The judge placed the document down on the bench and looked directly at him. The court now has official federal verification of the plaintiff's identity. The silence that followed was heavier than anything that had come before. For the first time that day, my father looked completely unprepared, and the courtroom was about to hear the final sentence that would destroy his entire story. The silence in the courtroom felt heavier than anything that had come before it. Just minutes earlier, my father had stood confidently in front of the judge and declared that I was an impostor. His voice had been steady, his story convincing. Many people in the room had believed him, but now everything had changed. The judge rested the Pentagon letter on the bench, his fingers lightly touching the document, as if he wanted to make sure everyone understood the weight of it. My father stared at the paper like it was something dangerous. His lawyer shifted nervously beside him, clearly searching for anything to say. The judge cleared his throat. The court recognizes this document as official confirmation from the Department of Defense. He said firmly, "It verifies the plaintiff's military service and confirms that false reports of his death were part of a classified operation." A low wave of whispers spread through the gallery. People who had looked at me suspiciously only moments ago were now staring at my father. The judge continued, "It also confirms that the plaintiff is indeed the biological son of the defendant." The words landed like a final verdict. My father didn't move. For years he had controlled the story. He had convinced relatives, friends, and even strangers that I was pretending to be someone else. He had erased me from his life and expected the world to believe him without question. Now the truth had arrived in the form of a single letter, and there was no way for him to argue with it. The judge turned his attention to my father's lawyer. "Do you wish to challenge the authenticity of this document?" The lawyer hesitated. He looked at the Pentagon seal again, then slowly shook his head. "No, Your Honor." The courtroom fell quiet again. The judge nodded once. "In that case, the court dismisses the accusation of identity fraud immediately." The tension that had filled my chest for years suddenly loosened, but the moment wasn't over yet. My lawyer stood up beside me. "Your Honor," she said calmly, "while we appreciate the court recognizing the truth, this case does not end there." My father slowly lifted his head. Confusion flickered across his face. My lawyer continued, "For several years, the defendant publicly accused my client of identity fraud. Because of those accusations, my client suffered severe damage to his reputation, financial losses, and unlawful removal from family inheritance." She paused before delivering the next sentence. "We are therefore filing a countersuit for defamation and financial damages." The words seemed to hit my father harder than the Pentagon letter. He finally looked directly at me. For the first time since the trial began, the confidence in his eyes was gone. In its place was something I had never seen before. "Fear," the judge nodded thoughtfully. "Given the evidence presented today," he said, "the court will allow the countersuit to proceed." My father's lawyer leaned toward him, whispering urgently, but my father barely seemed to hear him. He was still staring at me. For a long time neither of us spoke. This man had raised me. He had taught me how to ride a bike, how to fix a broken fence, how to stand up for myself. And yet he had also spent years trying to erase my existence, trying to convince the world that I wasn't real. The strange thing was, I didn't feel anger anymore. I didn't feel the urge to shout or celebrate. Instead, I simply stood there and met his gaze. "You called me an impostor," I said quietly. The words carried clearly through the silent courtroom. My father didn't respond. "There were years," I continued, "when I wanted to scream the truth. Years when people looked at me like I was some kind of fraud." I glanced briefly at the judge's bench where the Pentagon letter still rested, but the truth doesn't need to shout. The room remained completely silent. My father lowered his eyes slowly. In that moment, I realized something. The revenge I had imagined for so long wasn't loud or dramatic. It wasn't anger or humiliation. It was simply this, the truth standing calmly in front of everyone while the lies collapsed on their own. And as the judge prepared to move the case forward, I understood that the man who tried to erase me had just watched his entire story fall apart without me ever needing to raise my voice.